All right, welcome to week 2 of Mondays with Miss E. This week I will be reading chapters 4 through 6. Just kind of a refresher of last week. Last week we met the main character, Bets. She moved with her parents to California. Her father's in the military and he is getting ready to head off to the war in Vietnam. And we got just a little bit of a glimpse of the character of Miss E. So we're gonna pick up there this week. Before I start reading, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the t-shirt I was wearing last week. I'm wearing my Book Bus t-shirt last week. If you are not familiar with the Book Bus, it is a very cool mobile bookstore in Cincinnati. And I actually put the link to the Book Bus webpage in last week's video. So if you want to check out the Book Bus, even if you are not in the Cincinnati area, you can actually order from the Book Bus online. And the really, really cool thing about the Book Bus is that any of the profits from book sales go to purchase books for school libraries in low-income neighborhoods. So that's a pretty cool effort that the owner has going on there. And when I wore that t-shirt last week, it made me think about all the shirts I have that have something to do with books or some kind of connection to Miss E or some connection to my second book, Cross Country. So I am going to, every week on Miss E Monday, I am going to do my best to wear a new or different book-related t-shirt. So this week I have this aviation t-shirt on. This is one of the shirts that I got when Miss E first came out, and I kind of did this scramble to see if I could find any cool kind of old-time aviation type t-shirts. So this is one of them. And the thing I always think of with this t-shirt, when Miss E was first coming out, I was invited to be on a Meet the Author program that the Fairfax Network produces. And I was on the program with 3 other authors who all worked for Fairfax County Schools. And I wore this t-shirt and my jeans, and I showed up and everyone was dressed really nicely. And here I am in my aviation t-shirt. And I think everyone kind of looked at me like, who is this guy? But anyway, I thought I felt pretty cool in my airplane t-shirt, talking about Miss E. All right, without further ado, I will start reading this week's chapters. One thing about the chapters in Miss E, I'm calling them by number, just to kind of keep track of what's being read each week. But all the chapters in Miss E, you really can't see that, can you? A really bad glare from the sun on the book, but the chapters are not actually numbered, they're named. And I really, with each chapter, I tried to keep the chapter names down to just 1 or 2 words, these short little chapter titles. And sometimes it was a real challenge to find just that one word that really kind of encompassed what I felt was important about that chapter. So that was kind of a fun challenge as I was writing each chapter, and kind of rereading it. I feel like the chapter titles are a nice introduction to each chapter, and that they tell you a little bit about what's going to happen, but a lot of them sort of leave a little bit of a mystery as well. So this week, we will be reading Departure, Transition, and Routine. So this chapter is called Departure. There wasn't a day since we arrived in California that I hadn't thought about my father leaving. My friendship with Cassie and and Susan grew in the weeks after I met them. I settled into the daily routine in Forestville, and I made the most of each day, knowing that school was fast approaching. But in the back of my mind, no matter what I was doing, there remained an aching reminder that my father would be leaving soon. Pizza at Sonny's, my father is leaving soon. Board games at Ann's house, my father is leaving soon. Swimming in the creek, my father is leaving soon. Until the day that my father is leaving soon turned into my father leaves today. My mother hadn't brought up the subject of my father's departure since we moved to California. So as not to break my mother's illusion, my father had his usual smile on as he packed his duffel bag and got things ready to load into the car as if he were heading off to another day at the base. But when he looked at me, I could see right through it. His mouth smiled, but his eyes were saying, "I'm sorry, and I'll miss you," while his shoulders still hung in the "I wish I could fix this" pose he'd worn for the last month. My mother seemed to notice none of this. Sometimes it amazed me how my mother could spend nearly 20 years with my father and still not know how to read him. To me, his expressions and gestures said more than words ever could, and they never lied. No matter what my father was saying, I always knew what he was thinking and feeling just by looking at him, but my mother didn't. I just figured she spent too much time puttering around in the kitchen to actually look at my father when he was talking. "You want to help me with this, Bets?" my father called as he lifted up his bags, and the quick sideways movement of his head told me that he could carry double the bags without a lick of help from me. But what he really needed was for me to walk outside with him. My mother hummed over the dishes. I followed my father outside, and after he tossed his bags into the trunk, he closed it and hopped on top, putting his feet on the bumper. From nowhere, or maybe from a back pocket, he produced 2 Cokes and popped the caps off using the edge of a fender. With a quick tap on the trunk, he called for me to sit beside him and then passed me a Coke when I did. "You need to help your mother while I'm gone, Bets." "But," I tried to protest, ready to name all the things she should be doing for me, but a silent hand put a stop to my words. "I know you and your mother don't always see eye to eye," he said, taking a sip, then putting his arm around me to pull me closer. "But now's the time to fix that. With me away, your mother's going to need you just as much as you need her." I opened my mouth to argue again, but a look from my father made me swallow my words and drink the Coke instead. "Do what needs to be done, Bets, whether it's laundry or dishes or just helping to keep your mother's chin up." I knew it was the last word on the subject. I'd grumbled to my father before about my mother. To me, it seemed like she was along for the ride. She cooked and cleaned, of course, but my father really ran our family. His job and his drive for the next big thing determined where we went and where we lived. And though every new home, every move, she just seemed to do her thing each day and stick to her routine. It was a new town, sure, but they all had a grocery store. They all had a ladies' club and neighbors who played bridge and drank coffee. It was me who had to adapt, fill in the gaps, and make up for what my mother didn't do and what she didn't want to think about. That was the worst of all, because my mother had no reaction to my father's deployment, no emotion. Because my mother had no reaction to my father's deployment, no emotion, I felt it all the more. I was filling in the gap again. My father knew how I felt, would have known it even if I didn't bring it up a couple times while we were alone. But our conversations all ended in a pep talk, just like the one we are having on the trunk of the car, packed with my father's bags. "Keep your mother's chin up, Bats," had become my father's favorite line, and the worst part was he knew I'd do anything for him. We sat there for a short moment in silence, my father just staring off into the distance, with the sun turning his face into light and dark, shadow and bright. On anyone else, the harsh light would have been too much, but on my father, It only emphasized his best features. It made him look like someone on the black and white cover of a magazine. I gave him a quick nod to show I'd go along with his request, and then he hopped off the trunk. Come on, Bets, got something to show you. My father walked around the corner of the house, and I jumped off the car to follow. When I rounded the corner, I saw him standing next to a shining red bike. My feet stopped so quickly, they made a scuffling sound in the gravel of the driveway, and my father laughed at my open-mouthed surprise. I wanted a bike for years, but had never even had a used one. In Texas, my mother said I was too small, and in Kansas, we lived on the base, and she said that I didn't need one because everything was so close. Part of me had hoped that the move to California, coupled with starting high school, might mean a used yard sale find in the future. I'd never dreamed of a new bike. I took a step closer and ran my fingers along the smooth, shining chrome handlebars, and then the top of the red frame. I looked my father in the eyes, and the smile on his face made mine grow even bigger. Does Mom? My father laughed again. She wasn't sure at first, but I convinced her you'd need one if you were going to find a job while I'm away. My world spun. For the last 2 years, I'd wanted a job more than I'd wanted a bike even. The chance to take on responsibility of my own, to have a part of my life that wasn't school or home, and of course, money in my pocket that didn't depend on a please and thank you to my mother. A job? You don't mean it. My father smiled and nodded, then sized up the basket that hung from the handlebars. Seems like that basket would be able to carry a fair amount. Might want to stop by Johnson's Grocery tomorrow morning. I may have heard Mr. Johnson saying yesterday that the last delivery boy left in a rush after he got caught swiping sodas, and that he might be interested in hiring a responsible young lady like yourself. My only possible reaction was to push the bike aside so I could get to my father and throw both arms around his neck. I squealed a thank you, and he hugged me until my feet lifted off the ground. But the feel of my father's arms around me somehow reminded me that the bike and the job were a going away present, given to cheer me up and help me keep my mother's chin up while my father was away. I hugged him harder and whispered, "I love you, Daddy," in his ear. He put me down and looked me in the eye. I opened my mouth to tell him one more time that I didn't want him to go, but his voice stopped me. "I love you too, Bets." And then, after a long pause, "I'm not going to pretend that this is a walk in the park. Like your mother, my mind filled in. Vietnam's serious business. Boys are dying there. I'm one of the lucky ones because most of the time I won't be where the fighting is, but war's a dangerous place no matter what your job is. I won't pretend otherwise, so I'll make a deal with you." The expression on my face must have been enough to let my father know that in spite of my dislike for my mother's habit of avoiding the topic, his talk of war and dying was scaring the pants off of me. He smiled a little and crouched down to my height. "Bets, I'll do everything I can while I'm away to make sure I come home safe. That's my part. Your part is that you make each day the best that it can be." He saw the question on my face. No moping around, no feeling sorry for yourself or thinking people should treat you differently because your father's away. Enjoy your bike and all the places it can take you. Work hard at your job, and you'll be surprised at the satisfaction it brings you. And when I come home, you tell me about it. My father stood up and put out his hand. "Deal?" A handshake felt too formal, like my father was treating me like a grown-up, when all I really wanted right then and there was to be his little girl. "Cross my heart," I said, tracing an X over my heart and then putting my hands on my hips and waiting for him to return the promise. He quickly stood at attention, mimicking my gesture in a stiff and formal way and making the X just below the U.S. Army patch on his shirt. Then he laughed and messed up my hair. "Cross my heart. Now, you go try out that bike, Bets, while I check on your mother. It looks fast enough to fly." I hopped on, but didn't get my foot on a pedal before my father's voice stopped me. You're wrong about her, you know. I stood straddling my bike, suddenly too uncomfortable to turn around and look my father in the eye. Your mother knows what's going on as well as you do, he said, reading my thoughts from moments ago. Only difference is on the outside, Bets. I turned toward him, not sure what words were in my mouth, but it didn't matter. My father was already through the screen door and in the kitchen with my mother. All right. So a couple of things about this chapter. I was really kind of focused on creating that character of Bets's father and also creating that relationship between the father and the daughter. And I knew in the book as a whole that I had really kind of very little time to do that. So I knew that this chapter would be an important one to kind of let the reader in on the character of the father and the relationship. And then one comment on just the research that went into writing, historical fiction and writing in a time period. Some of that I feel like was history, and some of it I think of it more as fact checking. And this chapter has an example of that. Originally, when I wrote it, that "Cross Your Heart" promise was a pinky swear, and Bets had asked her father to pinky swear, and then just kind of in fact checking things, realized that was not really a thing in the 60s, that it hadn't come around yet. So I switched it to "Across Your Heart." Anyway, all right, on to transition. This is a tiny little chapter, and it has a pretty good title because it was really was kind of two things. It's kind of telling the story from Bets's perspective of how she's switching from her father suddenly being gone and getting used to that, and just from a writer's perspective, it was a chance for me to switch from those first chapters where we kind of get to meet characters and get to familiar with the setting and the relationships, and then really kind of transitioning into more of the action of the book. All right, transition. Our goodbyes at the airport were uneventful. I kept my chin up. My mother did the same with or without my help, and my father gave us hugs and kisses and smiles. Tearful goodbyes don't work so well when you're surrounded by a bunch of other kids and their fathers. My father and I had our talk on the trunk of the car. There was nothing left to say at the airport, and I couldn't say all the things I needed to say, because, of course, my chin was up. The ride home with my mother would not be deemed worthy of a school notebook scribbling, let alone a diary entry. The next few weeks were a blur. New bike, new job, 2 weeks and counting until school. With my father gone, I knew I'd need to keep myself busy, so I didn't waste any time heading to Johnson's. I stopped by the morning after my father left, riding my bike to town and getting there 15 minutes before Mr. Johnson even opened his store, because I wasn't used to how quickly pedaling could get me around. Riding my bike was an unimaginable thrill. It wasn't like I'd never ridden a bike before. I had a couple friends in Kansas who would lend me their bikes, but that was just to try out. A quick spin around the driveway or down to the corner and back, but this was for real. Now I was setting off for a destination. I was leaving home, riding along the open road with the wind in my hair and ticking off miles, each one adding to my sense of freedom. Excitement to surely rival being the first to climb a mountain or fly across an ocean. Mr. Johnson was expecting me, and instead of lobbying for the job I was crossing my fingers I'd get, I had it as soon as I walked in the door. So I found myself instead following him around the store as he stocked shelves and explained what would be expected of me. When I hopped back on my bike 10 minutes later, I was heading out to make my first delivery. The job wasn't full-time, barely even part-time, but I couldn't have asked for a better one. I arrived each morning when the store opened, bagged weekly orders that people had scheduled with Mr. Johnson, and then spent the next few hours biking around town back and forth between store and delivery destination. I was done by noon most of the time and had the rest of the afternoon to slip back into the remaining days of summer vacation with a pocket full of change from tips. I usually spent the afternoon with Anne, Cassie, and Susan. The first days after my father left, I went home thinking that my mother would want the company, but she was either busy in the kitchen or visiting with neighbors. She didn't really seem any different than before my father left. So after the third day, I just figured I'd go on my way and only step in if I noticed signs of her needing a chin-up intervention. Biking gave me a good chance to get to know more of Forestville beyond Front Street. Actually, there wasn't really much beyond Front Street. Technically, Forestville didn't extend very far beyond the center of town. A couple miles north or west of town was the State Natural Redwoods Reserve. Mr. Johnson had a couple customers who lived out that way, but only one who wanted things delivered. I suppose most people welcomed the trip to town. Head south or east of town, and there's a whole lot of empty space before you hit Santa Rosa. And anyone living out there probably takes their business to the larger town and leaves Forestville to the locals. Most kids my age don't worry much about exercise. We get enough just doing what kids do. But if I had needed a way to get in shape, spending my mornings crisscrossing town, loaded down with groceries, would have been a great way to do it. Susan commented after the first week that I looked different, and Cassie joked that El Molino High School didn't have a grocery delivering team, but I'd be a shoo-in for the track team if I kept it up. Before I knew it, I'd worked my way through 2 paydays, treated for pizza 3 times, managed to avoid my mother most of the time, and eventually found myself enjoying the last few hours of summer once again, sitting next to Susan on a park bench enjoying an ice cream cone. Her treat. All right, our last chapter for today is called Routine. And this finally gives us a look at Bets's new school and a little bit about what her school day is like, and eventually a look into one of her classrooms and a teacher that becomes pretty important for the rest of the story. El Molino High School was a dream. The school on base in Kansas was a prison in comparison. El Molino consisted of about 10 buildings, library, gym, auditorium, and various buildings housing classrooms. This layout, spread over 40 acres, meant that for many transitions between classes, students were walking outside from one building to another through a sunny but cool California September. No matter what class I'd endured, English, history, math, everything immediately faded to sunshine and fresh air once I stepped outside. Communist countries seeking to turn their youth into unquestionable followers should consider similar layouts. And I should mention that El Molino High School is a real high school in Forestville, California, and it looks a lot like that description. It's a scattering of buildings with a big outdoor courtyard, and they even have lockers outside. So check it out, El Molino High School. El Molino served several surrounding towns, so any claustrophobia from small town Forestville disappeared once I was at school. There were only so many kids to talk to in Forestville. I'd become friends with 3 of them. I knew a few more as friends of friends and recognized all the others, even if I didn't know their names. But the high school expanded on the local population times 10. Every classroom held the promise of new girls to become friends with, and boys. Here's the thing about base schools. Boys at base schools have fathers who are in the military. Fathers in the military tend to raise boys who are a lot like them. Fathers in the military also tend to be a lot like other fathers in the military. All this adds up to a lot of boys who are just way too much like my father to seem at all interesting in other ways. Not so at El Molino. My schedule, period 1, math. This would be cruel punishment, except the teacher is fresh out of college and seemingly feels the same way as I do when it comes to math before 10 a.m. She takes it easy on us and the first half of the class seems more like social hour than anything resembling algebra. Period 2, science. Freshman year is earth science. Considering we're surrounded by mountains and plains, get winds from the ocean, and straddle a fault that cuts the state in half, we're living right in the middle of units 2, 3, and 4. Period 3, history. The teacher wore a tie every day, but the anti-war poster behind his desk hinted at political views that most people in Forestville hadn't embraced yet. Fourth period, home ec. I cook, I sew, therefore I am. Lunch outside, cool and sunny. Fifth period, gym. I don't think any high school student enjoys changing into sweats and a t-shirt in the middle of the school day, but the bike delivery job paid off, and I seemed to be at the head of the class when it came to running, jumping, and otherwise exerting myself. Sixth period, English. The teacher comes to class late and goes off on tangents from his tangents. Each day we try to guess who will ask the question that sets the chain reaction in motion. Seventh period, photography. This one I lucked into. It's a popular class. The teacher is easy. It's a good way to end the day. And who doesn't like taking pictures? The class is filled with mostly sophomores and juniors, but there are a few freshmen who ended up there because it was the only class that fit their schedule. Lucky me. Excuse me. After the first 2 weeks, things settled into a routine. The classwork was easy. I've always done well in most classes without much effort, and this year was no different. Susan was in my English and science classes. Although I didn't really make any new close friends, I had a few people in every class who I talked to and never had a problem finding someone to sit with at lunch. This was 3 steps above Kansas. After school, I stopped by Johnson's each day. Mr. Johnson was fine with me switching to afternoons once school started. Most of his business came in through the door, and he didn't seem like he wanted to go out of his way to encourage deliveries. He was happy to pay me in order to keep those customers who wanted their groceries to arrive on their doorstep. But if he lost a few because their milk didn't get there before noon, he wasn't going to lose sleep over it. Most days, I finished my deliveries with time to spare for a stop at Sonny's, and then I headed home to take care of homework and dinner with my mother. Dinner and evenings with my mother, those first few weeks of school, actually seemed normal. The bits of conversation that had been spread out over an entire day while I was at home all the time were now compressed into an hour or two between school, homework, and bed. She asked about school, she asked about friends, and since everything was new and pretty exciting, I had a lot to talk about. Once we got into the swing of things, though, we slipped back into our usual superficial conversations. She would still ask about my day, but I could tell her attention was elsewhere. As I answered, I did the same to her, asking about her day, then letting my thoughts wander while she gave me answers that were long on routine and short on detail. After a few days of that, we seemed to realize it would be easier on both of us if we just kept quiet. I had settled into a routine at school, then work, then home. But to call it a routine doesn't make it sound like much fun, but it was fun. I went to a school that didn't seem like a prison. I had a couple of good friends, a pretty cool job, and money in my pocket. As September slipped into October, one day was pretty much like the next, and I liked it that way. So even though it sounds dull, same old, nothing new, stuck in a rut, you realize how nice a routine really is when something comes along and tips it upside down, especially when 2 somethings come along in the same day. There was a buzz in the hallway even before I got to history class. Kids leaving the room were all talking to each other, but clammed up when anyone else got close or tried to start a conversation, which was the opposite of the way things usually worked. Most of the time, kids leaving the classroom scattered like crows from a gunshot, eager to find a friend who was in another room, racing to find someone who had the answers to the test in science, or pretending to ignore the boy they had been sitting next to in class for the last 45 minutes. So before I even entered room 110, I knew something was different. The room was ringed with black and white photos. The anti-war posters still hung in the front of the room, but everything else had been taken down. The photos were at eye level, or what passed for eye level, for a group of teenagers who ranged in height from about 4 to 6 feet. Each photo showed a single person with little else in the background. Okay, so Mr. Flynn had redecorated, but that didn't explain all the chatter in the hallway. He held up 2 fingers in the V-shaped peace sign that had been finding its way into everyone's hands over the last few years. Most people held it high as if an end to the war were somewhere up above them if they could only reach it. But lately, I'd seen it flashed with an aggressive jab, like a shout for peace, punctuated with an "or else." A couple weeks into school, Mr. Flynn had adopted it as his signal for quiet. Those still drifting in took their seats quickly, and we all gave him our attention. Mr. Flynn was the best sort of teacher. He was able somehow to trick his students into being interested in whatever topic he was covering that day. He also managed to gain enough of our respect that we actually listened when he asked for quiet to please him. I imagine the school administration had felt otherwise. He was in his first year at El Molino, and the haircut and shave he'd certainly gotten for his interview had long since grown out. 100 pictures, 100 Americans, the faces of American history, our history. Mr. Flynn had a way of speaking when he wanted to add dramatic effect. His sentences shortened, some not even sentences, and with pauses between each, they started to sound like lines in free verse poetry. Your assignment, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Albert Einstein. Others I was unsure of. Was that Franklin Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson? But most I had no idea. As I turned my head from side to side, looking at each face, I discovered something. The faces alternated, male, female, all the way around the room. 50 men, 50 women. Clearly, Mr. Flynn's list of 100 important Americans was not pulled from the pages of our history textbook. And though many of the faces staring back at me were white, some were black, Asian, Hispanic. 2 were clearly American Indian, pretty significant considering everyone sitting in the classroom looked just like me. Your task is simple, Mr. Flynn started again, and then proceeded to explain an assignment that did not sound simple at all. As a class, you need to identify these 100 Americans. You'll also need to explain in a sentence of 20 words or less why each deserves a place on these walls. 20 words or less is the sort of assignment that sounded easy, but really wasn't. Your average kid would think, cool, I only have to write 100 short sentences. But how do you explain why Abraham Lincoln was important in 20 words or less? Then there were all the faces I didn't recognize. Finding out who someone is based on their picture was like knowing someone's phone number and trying to find out their name by looking in the phone book. Were we just supposed to start flipping through encyclopedia volumes until we came across someone who looked familiar? Based on the grumblings in the room, everyone else felt the same way. Mr. Flynn held up his hand again, and we quieted. British intelligence during World War II deciphered a German code that was so complex it was considered unbreakable. They did it by putting their best people together in a room. He had said the magic word. Juniors and seniors are usually motivated to work hard in school because they're close enough to see the next step, maybe go to college or get an actual adult job. But freshmen need a little bit more, and Mr. Flynn was smart enough to dangle a prize in front of us. I have a friend who works as a clerk in San Francisco City Hall. He has offered to give us a tour of City Hall, and while we're in San Francisco, we'll take a tour of the city. But he can only accommodate one class, the first class to success. But he'd already said enough. It didn't matter that we'd be visiting some boring city hall and then playing tourist. In 1967, San Francisco was the place to go for music. Janis Joplin, Grace Slick, Jerry Garcia, There was no telling who else. And they weren't just playing in clubs. They were living there, walking the streets and hanging out on the corners. With a whole day spent crisscrossing the city, we were certain to run into someone. No amount of peace signs would have allowed Mr. Flynn to control the chaos that ensued. Everyone was immediately out of their seat to get a closer look at the photographs. Paper was pulled from binders and names were jotted down. A group in the corner argued about Franklin Roosevelt, or was it Wilson? In a gesture that cemented my standing in freshman society, I was pulled into a group that was strategizing the best. As we waited for the bell, I ended up eye to eye with one of the photos. A photo of a woman, I thought in her mid-30s, maybe around my mother's age. She smiled a big, friendly smile, but it didn't show in her eyes. Years of reading my father's expressions made that easy to see. Her eyes looked tired, as if she'd been squinting into the sun all day. The woman wore a leather jacket, which seemed normal, but something about the picture made me think it was taken long ago, at a time when a woman wearing something like that would have seemed a little bit odd. Her hair was a mess. Not like a hairdo that had been blown in the wind and ruined. It looked intentionally careless. And something in the woman's eyes said that her appearance was as she wanted it. Tousled hair and leather jacket, regardless of what anyone else thought. Her hands, planted firmly on her hips, added to her resolve. The photographer must have been positioned lower than the woman. She was looking down slightly, and because the camera was pointing up, the background revealed nothing but sky. In spite of the excitement in the room, Mr. Flynn had the last word. This is the real world, ladies and gentlemen. You work together to accomplish a goal. Each one of you is responsible for the group's success or its failure. And the folks out in the hallway want you to fail so that they can win. Welcome to life. Leave it to Mr. Flynn to figure out what made us all tick. In a high schooler's mind, there was nothing more powerful than the fear of letting the team down. Forget adrenaline. The only thing moving that runner toward home plate or the halfback to a touchdown was the fear that he'd face in the locker room if he messed up. The bell rang and we left the classroom. I became part of the chatter in the hallways. But all the way to my next class, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's tired, squinting eyes were still watching me. All right. So what can I say about that chapter? A lot of times people will ask if Mr. Flynn is based on me, because I used to be an English teacher. He's a history teacher. But I think Mr. Flynn is, I wish I could be a teacher like Mr. Flynn. I think he's probably based on a lot of high school teachers that I had, and just kind of my memory of high school. As far as his project, one really kind of fun thing in imagining Mr. Flynn's project was thinking about what it would be like as a student to do this project in 1967. It would be very different for us to do it today, certainly. All right, so that is reading for this week. There's a link to the discussion. Should be a link at the bottom of the video. And there, I also added a link. I mentioned the Meet the Author program that I was on. I also added a link to that YouTube recording. So if you want to check out Meet the Author on Fairfax Network, you have that as well. So thank you for tuning in, and join the online discussion if you want. And I will see you next week.